Hi, this is Eternal King here, bringing you another LOR video today. So I wanted to talk a little bit about micro versus macro plays. So in the Eternal format specifically, and the reason why I enjoy it so much, and this is also true for MTG Modern, for example, is that the exact way that you pilot a given deck matters far less than the deck that you are piloting. I will give you, so for example, like you could pick a deck in MTG Modern, and if it's filled with low tier cards, inexpensive cards, it doesn't matter how good of a player you are. If that deck isn't at least competitive, you cannot win the game. You cannot, LOR is actually a very balanced game, but MTG specifically it is less so. That if you are playing cards, the equivalent of a Darius, for example, in MTG Modern, you would not be able to win games. Just like period, full stop. It is a pay-to-play format. MTG Modern is a case where the people with the most expensive cards do actually win more. And the entire MTG economy is based on the relative value, rarity, and competitiveness of said cards in their extended card format. LOR has some crossover there, in the sense that the way that you build your deck is far more important than the way that you play your deck. Typically speaking, I'm more scared of players running a list that I'm not familiar with immediately than I am of a top Masters player running a deck that I am deeply familiar with. Part of it is the Kinder Surprise value, but part of it is also that there's simply harder things to play around, or just, good cards that the opponent's running that are currently undervalued in the meta. That's kind of the more accurate scenario. So I'll give you an example. This is Ziggs Poppy, right? So currently Ziggs Poppy is down to 55% in Eternal. And my take on it is that does not need to be the case. It is the case that it's simply bad to run Ziggs Poppy as is in the current Eternal format. So I made some small changes that I felt optimized the list that took this deck from what I would consider to be a 55% deck to back to its, auto-winning 60% of games, if not more than that. So let's talk about those changes, those small macro decisions that I made that were more important than micro decisions during the play of the game. Which again, I'm not a bad player by any means, top 100 Masters player, but the point being that I'm telling you that the time that you spend here matters more than the time you spend in there. Standard is the opposite. Like you'll see people piloting like complete trash piles to like an 80% win rate in Standard because it really is just like player over deck. And then in Eternal, it's deck over player, which is what I like about it because it means that I get to spend more time being creative and optimizing and building decks. But not everyone's into that. So talking about like macro decisions, right? So Brothers Bond over Whispered Words, pretty big, right? Pretty big, just like that one card inclusion in your competitive deck. This matters more than anything that you would do in the game, right? Just this. That alone matters more than anything you do over the course of the game. So when you say that I'm going to run the list without one draw and one Brothers Bond, what you're saying is that I'm far more willing to tech into a one-off burst lethal scenario than I am willing to draw into a burn win scenario. You value essentially lethal on board more than you value I got a top deck decimate, right? Like I need to draw a 2 and hit that decimate. I value the on-board lethal more. I value also the board trades more. So, for example, if you like Vandal City Mayor doesn't trade well to 2/3 for 3 mana, that's going to trade very poorly into like a Badger Bear or whatever. Stone Stackers is a 2/3 for 2 mana. It might not trade well in all scenarios, and then you just stack the Brothers Bond on the Stone Stackers and the Vandal City Mayor. So that one-off inclusion, which I've always done in my Ziggs Poppy, by the way, even when I hit top 100 Masters, with Ziggs Poppy, when I was like hardcore one weekend ladder climbing with Ziggs Poppy, like really sweating it out, which I don't do that often. When I was really sweating it out, I was one Brothers Bond into Ziggs Poppy, I found that it was, generally speaking, better than Whispered Words in almost all scenarios in terms of how I play. Typically, when I'm aggro into control, my whole point is just to drain resources from the control player until they're out of mana, and then I can guarantee lethal. That's usually what you do. So that's, a macro decision, and that matters more than anything else. And then the other macro decision that I would do right now is Vex over Poppy. So again, Poppy was nerfed to be a 4 mana 3/3, which means that if the opponent is able to answer Poppy with 3 damage, that's all they need, like a Get Excited would work, for example, an Aftershock would work, for example. Even a Culling Strike or the Shadow Owl's equivalent of a Culling Strike, any of that stuff works on Poppy. And there's nothing this deck can do to stop the opponent from snap removing Poppy. But what I found through the, playing with people is that Tempo Vex is just nuts. Like, this is like standard player tech here, which I'm actually agreeing with. Tempo Vex is nuts. Like just 4 mana, 5/4 fearsome with a Gloom proc. That is as strong as a 3/4 face and board ping. So Vex is just, Ziggs for 4 mana. Like, that's what Vex is. Vex can be considered Ziggs for 4 mana. Which you already have Ziggs on 3 mana. So if you Ziggs and then Vex, it's like the biggest, nastiest tempo play imaginable. Requires insanely specific answers that many decks just don't possess, right? Even good decks. So I played this exact construction into meta temple, meta ping spam temple, and yeah, we won quite handedly because, and they had temple on board and they cycled their hand like 3 times, and I ate like nothing but removal the entire game. Board wide removal. They had everything. Like, everything they possibly could have had. They had a perfect hand and a perfect game. And I still ate them alive. Because of just, I understand how to... first of all, when you play Battle City Mayor, and this is, the one micro decision that does matter versus macro. When you play Battle City Mayor, always pull big stuff. In a Ziggs Poppy shell, when you're cycling with Battle City Mayor, this whole deck is nothing but small stuff. There's no reason to cycle into more small stuff. Cycle into something bigger. Cycle into a 4 mana card, cycle into a 5 mana card, maybe even a 6 mana card. Sometimes I do the guy that summons a shark who's 7 mana, but then he's 6 mana with the Vandal City Mayor discount. Like, just cycle into bigger things that demand different types of removal cards from your opponent. And if you do that, that's usually higher value than cycling into garbage tokens, because your deck's nothing but garbage cards, right? It's all 1-drops. So yeah, there is some micro decisions that matter. The way that you play Mayor will make or break a Ziggs Poppy player. But then beyond that, it's mostly macro decisions. Vex being better than Poppy, because the way that people play right now, you're never going to get a critical mass of 1-drops going without the opponent answering. It's just not happening. And they'll usually answer with creature parity or cyclers or chumpers or whatever. So you'll never get that critical mass for Poppy. And then when Poppy comes down, she instantly dies. So you just play, essentially 1-drop, 2-drop, Ziggs, Vex. And you just do that line, and it's just like, what do I do? That is such nasty tempo. Yeah, so again, it's a mixture of macro and then a little bit of micro with the Battle City Mayor, but that's it. You don't need to fully optimize and get into your own head in terms of how you play this deck. It's a very easy deck to pilot. It's very hard to go wrong beyond the common mistake I see is cycling too small with Mayor. You cycle big with Mayor. Cycle big with Mayor, and then run the Vex, and then run the 1. So that's the macro decision there. So I lost pretty much every game I was playing with Ziggs Poppy until I made the macro decision that it was better to be on Tempo Vex than Tempo Poppy. That's just what I found. And where did I get the idea from? Well, I got it from other good players, right? You have to look and examine what the macro decisions other players are making. So this is one of the top burn aggro shells for standard specifically, and I saw that they were on Tempo Vex, right? They're on Tempo Elise, Tempo Vex, just because they're good champions. Literally no other reason. They're just good champions that are overstated for their curve. And when I realized that good champions that are just overstated for their curve could essentially carry deck constructions, I was just like, we'll just do that in Ziggs Poppy, and it'll be one of the best decks in the game. Once again. And it is. So, easy peasy, right? So yeah, you can run Shadow Burn, very competitive, run Ziggs Poppy, but again, do it with the right macro decisions, because that's going to matter more than the exact micro decisions you make. There are some exceptions, right? Like I'll drag lifesteal units to the right. Like that's super important micro decision. Like don't give people free. If you have lethal, like take the lethal. Like, you know, usually stuff like that. But yeah, for the most point, macro over micro. Making the macro decision in a mid-range shell to run 3 Sisters as a 3-of, as opposed to a lot of tempo spam stuff. That is a macro decision that matters a lot, right? The Sky Splitter Troll Champ, like you could very easily just run this in your Jax deck. But the decision not to run those is a very important macro decision. You're saying, no. 3 Sisters to react, Fish Fight to react, and then cycle draw. And again, it's just a pure meta call. And it's a macro decision you need to make, and whether you make it right or wrong is going to make or break your deck. So deciding to just discard extra equipment and cycle versus protecting, going all in on keep Jax alive, right? So essentially tempo versus long-term value and responsiveness is the decisions you're kind of making. Same thing with Azir Aurelia, right? So the macro decision to either be spell responsive or one drop spam heavy. And like that macro decision matters more than the exact piloting of Azir Aurelia. The reality is that Azir Aurelia with Emperor's Army is an exceptionally easy to pilot deck. You 1 count, you 2 count, you 3 count, then you go crazy. Like that's as far as your micro decisions are concerned, and you know, play your sparring students essentially. That's the full extent of your micro decisions there. It's mostly macro. Is going to determine how the game plays out. Whether you are the one drop spam version of Azir Aurelia, so Forsaken Bakai, Sparring Student, Treasure Seeker, one Dune Keeper, versus, you know, and I can just show you what kind of macro spells you can add to your deck to make it, you know, bounces, right? Lead and follow. Or alternatively, you have the more competitive bounce, which is old school tech retreat, right? So like usually you could be on like 2 retreats and returns, and like that would be an important macro decision to the way that you want to play the deck. Essentially that you're making the call that people have snap removal for Azir and snap removal for Aurelia. I'm currently making the meta call that they don't have snap removal for a 1/5 on 3. Like I'm just making that meta call with this deck, and that macro decision matters. That macro decision matters hugely. It matters more than anything you do during the game. Because again, everyone's been playing LOR long enough that they can play competently. It's not about the plays anymore. Nobody gets excited. Like I don't get excited watching, for example, Sunny play LOR with a nonsense standard grinder deck for, you know, an hour. Like it's not exciting for me. I immediately tune out because that's, you know, again, the micro plays don't really matter to me that much as the deck that he's running, which is usually in standard not as interesting. But something like this, right? The macro decision to run 2-year-old swim deck into current standard players and have that deck, you know, win all of its games based off of pure burst value. That macro decision matters. That macro decision matters hugely in terms of how this deck pilots, right? Acorn into Esmus, into, you know, sometimes it's like a Darkened Lodestone, and then into, you know, crazy burst value, top end. That matters so much in terms of what the opponent has to do to counter you and properly optimize into you. So a lot of the time, when it comes to the Eternal format, opponents are dead before they get into the game. This is something you just have to understand, that like if you're just running a bad meta deck, doesn't matter how well you play it, right? So like Lurk is a bad meta deck right now in both Standard and Eternal. It only wins 50% of games in either format, so it's not a good deck to play. It doesn't matter if you play it optimally, it doesn't matter if you play it suboptimally. It's just a bad deck to run right now, objectively speaking. There's so much better stuff to run in Eternal. Temple, Elder Dragon, Swain Nora, Azir Aurelia, Thresh Nasus, all, Ziggs Poppy or upgraded Ziggs Poppy, as I would refer to this, a keyword soup style deck. All of these things are simply better, right? They're just better than anything else. A ramp solution of some kind. Rise, right? Optimal Rise, my list of Optimal Rise. And then, you're kind of, if you want to be entirely off meta, like, well, 100%, nobody's doing this, you can try testing out the different types of archetypal mid-range and see how that goes for you. And it's going to just depend on how sweaty your opponent is and what they're running. If they're running this, specifically this deck, which is what I see, this is the most competitive version of Sunken Temple. There are a lot of macro decisions with the way this deck is built that makes it susceptible to certain things. It's very susceptible to temple removal or landmark removal. It's very susceptible to go big strategies because nothing about this deck has tools to answer big things. Very few bounces, right? Very, very few bounces. There's no mini morphs. There's no, there's one wallop, so you get one stun, and then the rest of the deck just has to, like, high roll bounces or stuns or just, like, luck into it. Like, it's very devastating to just say, into this deck specifically, like, I went big and I killed your temple. And it's just like, okay, well, I'm just going to concede. I can't win off of those macro decisions. I played Eddie and it was running 3 explore cards. Like, that temple deck's not gonna get there. Impossible. It's just absolutely impossible. So these are the kinds of things that you want to be thinking about if you want to be an optimal player. Like, if somebody runs, I've lost to Poro King. I would call it somewhat, like, not consistently, but semi-consistently, because they're making a macro decision that I was not prepared for, right? So they're making a macro decision that they're going to play small stuff that they have infinite numbers of, and then they're going to play King, and then they're going to make all the stuff bigger. And, like, that macro decision of, however they want to run it, usually it's Freljord King with the likes of, like, this guy, right? I always undervalue Ingvar in Poro spam shells, but yeah, usually it's Ingvar, right, to essentially be an extra version of Poro Snacks. Poro Stories, Poro Herder, Patched Porobot I see pretty consistently, so it's like this 2-drop shell here, Poro Herder to cycle, and then your 1-drop spam construction, Borealis, Poro King, etc. Pretty straightforward in terms of what a Poro deck is. And yeah, it's one of those things where, like, if you're not prepped, it's a problem, right? Poro King, when you're not prepped, is like a nightmare. It's like nightmare fuel. Optimal played Poro King when you're not prepped is just nuts. You just don't have the removal for Poro King on 5, or they get 2 Poro Kings, or they're just, like, super curving out perfectly in casual with, like, Poro Stories, 1-drop spam, double snacks, King, you know what I mean? Like, it's just pure nightmare. And then, like, Ingvar, like, pure nightmare fuel. Absolutely. I'm more scared of that than I am scared of, like, any meta deck that I 100% know. So, like, that macro decision to run a archetypal deck, at least decently, and when you're being off meta, is actually more of a challenge to me as one of the top players in Eternal than, like, just running the meta deck, right? You just run Temple. I know this deck. I'm just gonna eat it up, right? I'll eat it up with most constructions. Absolutely. It doesn't matter how you play, how good you are. I'm just gonna eat this deck alive. Eddie, Eddie's a bit tougher because it is, matron spam, which is at, like, very high value. But even then, if I know that everyone's going Eddie, I can make deck adjustments and still win most of the time. But yeah, that random, Poro King player, that random Anivia player that has a deck of nothing but answers, right? Like that, I'm just like, I don't know what to do. Like, I have no idea, it's just so different than the normal play patterns of the game. It's so outside the realm of, like, what you normally play. that the macro decision to run these styles of decks is far, far and away more important. Like, you could be silver tier, and if you make the right macro calls on like an Anivia deck or a Poro King deck, that's gonna be more problematic for me than like, you know, I was top 10 masters in standard 5 seasons in a row, and I'm playing a deck that I pulled off Runeterra AR. I'm gonna be like, I don't care. Like, it literally does not matter to me because I'm just making the right macro calls into what you're doing. This is Eternal King, signing out.